So hello everyone. Thank you first of all for the kind invitation. My name is Khaled Abedrabboh. I am a postdoctoral researcher at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Today I will be talking about the work of our research group, the Energy Markets and Policy Research Group at Hamad bin Khalifa University. And the talk is titled Game-Theoretic Market Mechanisms for Sharing Distributed Energy Resources. So a little bit about myself. I currently work as a postdoctoral researcher at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and I did my bachelor's in electrical engineering from the University of Jordan, and my master's in sustainable electrical power from Brunel University, London, and my PhD in sustainable energy from Hamad bin Khalifa University. And my research interests include the applications of game theory, optimization, and data science in energy and cyber-physical systems. This is the outline of today's talk. First, we'll go for the motivation, then literature review, and then we'll talk about the methodology, case study, results, and conclusions. And this work was published in two papers, a review paper and an original article. So the motivation behind this research is that the global energy demand is always increasing, and we'd rather to cover that demand by using renewable energy generation instead of fossil fuels because of their environmental impact and because they suffer from scarcity. And so you can have the renewable energy generation by going for three options. The first is to invest in large scale power plants from renewable energy, so like a large scale PV power plant. However, these have high investment costs, and keep in mind that the renewable energy resources are intermittent. And so imagine like a large PV farm being out of service because of weather conditions. So this can have cascading effects on the grid, which can result in blackouts. The third option is to have small-scale renewable energy generation, and these can be installed by small consumers. However, these also have harmful effects on the grid because they are uncontrollable and which can lead to over voltages or bad harmonics to the grid. And they also suffer from underutilization. Because of this small scale, they tend to be mainly for one consumer. And so if there is no demand for this consumer, then the renewable energy generation can go to waste. So the solution we propose is to invest in medium-scale renewable energy generation, and this can be done by third parties or independent investors. They can install medium-scale stations for renewable energy, and they can adopt market mechanisms for selling these services either to the grid or to local consumers directly. And so this leads us to the conclusion that we would like to design combinatorial markets for sharing these resources locally. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about distributed energy resources. These include two main components, renewable energy resources, which can include solar PV, distributed wind turbines, or any other distributed generation. However, these also are intermittent and uncertain. The other component can be energy storage systems, and these can include battery energy storage systems, electric vehicles, or even electric vehicle charging stations. However, these also suffer from high investment costs. So what we would like to do is develop markets where multiple DER providers, these are third-party companies who invest in these resources. And we want to develop a market for these DR providers to share their resources or sell their resources to the local community which is a community of consumers. And so what we would like to achieve is for the consumers to save on energy costs and emissions, and for the DER providers to maximize their revenue. So we want to make these DERs profitable to their independent investors. And this scheme is also beneficial to the utility company or the electricity grid because they can have higher penetration of renewables without having investment costs. So before we went into the market, we did a literature review, and we found two common market designs for local energy markets. The first is based on Vickrey-Clark-Grove's mechanism, where we have a central auctioneer. One second, can I pointer? Yeah. So the first, we have a central auctioneer who uses a closed form utility function, and they ask the consumers to bid their private information, so private types. Then the auctioneer can form the utility functions of all the consumers, and they can optimize social welfare based on those utility functions. And then they optimize the social welfare and determine the allocation for each household or consumer. So we've noted that this adopts a direct revelation mechanism, and it's central in terms of the allocation being determined by the central entity, which is the auctioneer. It's implemented in one shot, which is a good attribute. However, it still suffers from limited scalability because for Vickrey-Clark-Groves, you have to solve n+1 optimization problems, which can be nonlinear in some cases. The other common market design we've encountered in the literature is where an auctioneer have an iterative price auction where they announce prices and collect demand bids from the households or the consumers. And then they use this demand to update the price again. And this keeps happening iteratively until there are no changes in the demand of the consumers. So this is an indirect revelation mechanism. It's distributed in terms of the allocation. So here the households determine their demand. However, it's iterative, which also can lead to limited scalability. And when we talk about energy markets, scalability is a huge attribute because we usually have 50 or even 100 local consumers in a single distribution network. So we did a Sankey diagram of this literature, and we found that almost no market has all the desirable properties, which is having an indirect revelation mechanism implemented in one shot, and the allocation is determined centrally, but also having a scalable mechanism. So we started going into the market design, and we're using mechanism design. So the background to mechanism design is that every market has three main rules: the messaging rules, which determine what information can be included in the bids, and what agreements can be struck between the players or the market participants. And we have an allocation rule, which determines which trading parties get what quantities, what trading quantities, and of course, a payment rule. And so we use mechanism design to set these rules in order to achieve some desired objectives. And we assume that every market participant has private preferences that represent their utility function. And of course, we assume that the objective of self-interested rational players is to maximize their utility functions. So in this, we've opted to use combinatorial auctions because we have multiple resources. We saw that we had the PV, wind, energy storage systems, and electric vehicles. So these can have specific characteristics. And uh, these items are actually complementary, where the value of a combination of items is higher than their aggregate values. And combinatorial auctions are beneficial in such settings because they enhance the economic efficiency. So let's talk about the desirable properties. Um, in this market, where we have multiple DER providers and multiple consumers, we want to have an efficient allocation of these distributed energy resources. We want to achieve cost savings and emission savings for the consumers and maximize the revenues for the providers. So these all lead to that we need to design a combinatorial auction, and that can also optimize social welfare. One of the desirable properties also to preserve the privacy of the consumers. And so this determines our bidding rules. And we want to limit the uncertainty of renewable energy generation. And this can be solved by having real-time auctions. So, so usually in the local energy markets, they have a day-ahead market. However, in this research, we're aiming to achieve a real-time market where it can be an hour ahead instead of a day ahead. So predicting your renewable energy generation an hour ahead is much, much easier than predicting the whole day. And the main desired property here is scalability. And this means that we need to have also a one-shot mechanism. So the consumer model, we assume that these are self-interested and rational players, and so they want to maximize their utilities. And we assume that there will be carbon credits or carbon tax for the energy services. And so utility is not only cost savings by using these resources, but also emission savings. However, each consumer would set their weight for these emission savings. This weight can be in the units of currency per gram of CO2 equivalent. So the utility function will be a combination of cost savings and weighted emission savings. And note that the strictly cost minimizing consumers can just set their gammas to 0, and then their utility would only be composed of the cost savings. And each consumer has a demand, which we assume that is not flexible. So we are not trying to compromise the comfort of consumers. So to set this market, to give the setting of this market, we need also to talk about the grid energy, grid power. So each consumer can also get their demand from the grid. They don't have to get their demand from the DER providers. And this grid demand is priced, the prices of this grid power is a quadratic function of the total demand. So this is the total demand of the consumers. Let's assume that this is it. Then the grid price would be the quadratic function of this demand, this aggregate demand. And we also assume that the marginal emission factors, which measures the um, the emissions of a unit kilowatt hour, a unit of energy. We assume that these are known to both the grid and the consumers. So this is the architecture of the, um, or this is the structure of this market mechanism, where we have multiple DR providers who can have different resources and multiple consumers. So again, to reiterate the desirable properties, we want to have a combinatorial, we want to design a combinatorial double auction for sharing these resources with the consumers that optimizes social welfare and preserves the privacy and is a real-time auction and can be implemented in one shot. So we propose this architecture where each provider has uh, has different resources, but each resource has three main characteristics, and these include the energy limit, the price of this resource, and the marginal emission factors. So each resource has a capacity. The provider cannot provide more than this capacity, and they set the price of this resource per kilowatt hour per unit of energy, and the emission factors, which is in CO2 equivalent per also unit of energy. And so we want also to have this market in real time or an hour ahead auction. So let's talk about the setting first. So we have a set of consumers, which is N, represented by N. M is the set of DER providers. K, J, sub J, is the set of resources per DER provider. So this would be the set of resources for provider J. And each resource is represented by its energy limit, price, and emission factors. This is the energy limit of that resource. This is the price of that resource, and this is the emission factor of that resource. And each consumer I has demand Di, which can be divided into vector Dig, Dij, K. So Dig is the demand of that consumer from the grid, and Dijk is the demand of that consumer from the DER providers, and specifically resource K of DER provider J. And so if they get this demand, they have a utility, Uij, for being matched with provider J. And so the flow of this combinatorial double auction is that providers bid their resource characteristics for each of their resources. They bid the energy limit, the price, and the emission factors. Then consumers bid their utility and demand from each provider. So we represented that bid in this vector, which has, first of all, the utility of being matched to provider J, and then the demand from each resource of that provider. And so they bid for each provider. They send all their bids to the auctioneer, and then the auctioneer, which here is represented by the distribution system operator, matches the consumers to the DER providers by solving the social welfare optimization problem. So if we have all this information, how can we formulate the social welfare optimization? We introduce a matching vector, Xij, which is a binary vector. And if 0, that means that consumer I is not matched with provider J. And if it's 1, then consumer I will be matched with provider J. So the social welfare has two components, the buyers welfare. This is the welfare of all consumers. And it's just this matching vector multiplied by the utility of being matched to that provider. And also the other component of the social welfare is the seller's revenue, which is that matching vector multiplied by the sum of the demand that is bid by the consumers multiplied by the price they set for that resource. And we implement an XOR bidding rule. So only one of the bids of the consumers will be accepted. Or at most, one of the bids will be accepted. And one of the constraints is that you can't accept the bids if the energy limit of that resource is violated. So the social welfare optimization problem here is an integer linear program, which is easy to solve. And then we move to the consumer's bidding strategy in this auction. So here, the consumers wish to minimize their disutility. So the disutility has two components, has a cost component and a weighted emission component. And so they minimize their total cost and emissions and weighted emissions by determining their demand from each resource from each provider. And so their cost, their demand will be divided into demand from the grid and demand from the resources or the distributed energy resources from these providers. And their emissions will be the same, their emissions from the grid and their emissions from the DER providers. And to calculate their utility by being matched to a certain provider, we just calculate so we calculate this utility without this Dij, so it will be only their disutility from the grid, so their cost and emissions from the grid, minus this utility, the optimized disutility, by being matched with a provider. So in this research, we've investigated 3 types of DER providers. These are main types. So this is without any loss of generality. And the first type has a PV, so a renewable energy generation, and a battery energy storage system. The second type has a wind turbine and a battery energy storage system. The third type has also a PV generation, but with an electric vehicle charging station. So we modeled the revenue maximization strategies for each of these providers. And so for this problem, we needed to introduce a scheduling horizon because they need to schedule their battery storage. And basically, they optimize, so they determine their prices per resource, and they optimize their offers, so their energy limits for each of these resources. And this is the same for the wind turbine plus the battery energy storage system. However, for the electric vehicle charging station, this not only has uncertainty factors from the PV generation, but also has uncertainty factors from the EV arrival and departure times. So here, instead of determining the scheduling horizon, the scheduling horizon is specified based on actual events. So each time an event happens, the DER provider can then maximize their revenue, or by determining these energy limits. For the case study, we used this distribution network, which is a reference distribution network published by IEEE. And we had these three DER providers, and we got data for 100 consumers. And all the data we used are from the UK Low Carbon London project. So these are published datasets. And all simulations were run in Python 3. This is a table of the DER resources. So we had three providers, each having a renewable energy resource and a storage resource. So these are the three types of these providers. And here we determined the capacity, the prices per unit of energy, and the emission factors. And these are also based on references. And we compared our results with two cases: a baseline system, which basically has no DER providers, so all consumers can only get their demand from the grid, and all providers cannot sell their resources to the consumers. However, they can sell it to the grid at a low feed-in tariff. And we also compared our results with a case of a K-double auction, which treats all energy resources as a homogeneous product. So first of all, we looked at the results in terms of the demand from the grid and the offered the resources versus the purchased resources after the outcome of the auction. So we've noticed that our proposed combinatorial double auction performs much better than the other two variants. And this is just because the K-double auction treats this as a homogeneous product, so it doesn't take in account the emission factors or the combinatorial nature of these resources. We've also looked at the results in terms of emission savings, cost savings for the consumers, and the revenues of the DER providers. And we've seen, for example, for the emissions, for the cost, we've noted that there is not much difference in the cost savings of all three systems. However, for the emissions, um, the emission savings in the proposed combinatorial double auction were lowered by 24%, whereas in the K-double auction, it was only lowered by 12%. And for the revenues, this is where we have the best results. Here, for these two types of providers, type 2 and type 3, so the wind turbine and battery energy storage system, and the PV and electric vehicle charging station, the revenues were even higher than the K-double auction by almost 80%. So to summarize these main results, we can see that although the energy costs are almost all the same in the three cases, the baseline system, the K-double auction, and the proposed combinatorial double auction. However, the social welfare is highly maximized in the combinatorial double auction. And this is again because the combinatorial double auction allocates the low emission DERs. So the PV, for example, which is a low emission renewable energy resource, to the consumers with the highest weight for emissions. So then we looked at the strategic sizing of these resources. So at first we assumed arbitrary sizes. These are based on the aggregate demand. But then we manipulated these sizes and measured their effect on the revenues. So for example, this is for one type of the providers, which had the PV and the battery energy storage system. And we've noted that any increase in the battery energy storage system capacity uh, achieves minimal revenue improvements. However, if you increase the PV power capacity, the revenue is highly affected. So this can limit any investments in battery energy storage systems. And also, so the main case, we assume that each provider prices their resources based on the grid price. And so we've not looked at how to price these resources. However, we try to vary these prices and so their effect on the revenue. And we've noted that it's highly dependent on the consumer's average weight for emission reduction. So if the emission reduction is high, if these weights, if the average weight is high, then the DER providers uh, can adopt high prices, but also achieve high revenues. However, if the average is low, then if you adopt high prices, then your revenue will be minimized because you won't be able to sell any of these resources. And so this leads us that any knowledge of the average weight for emission reduction can be exploited by the DER providers. And this is a limitation of this work. Then we also looked at the optimal placement of these DER providers. So at first we have, this is the representation of the network we looked at. And here the distances in these lines, in these branches, represent the losses, the energy losses. And so at first we arbitrarily placed these providers, but then we changed their locations and tried to optimize the energy losses. So after this iterative optimization, the locations of these providers were like, so before it was like this, and then they changed, and this achieves significant um, reduction of the energy losses. So this highlights the importance of network planning. So a utility company who wants to adopt this market mechanism can first run this iterative optimization and determine the locations, the optimal placement of these DER resources. So next, we wanted to measure the scalability. And here we varied the number of consumers. So for the 100 case, which we had, the calculation time was almost 1 second. And then we had almost 5,000 consumers, and the calculation time is still within 80 or 90 seconds, which is a very good result because this is implemented in one shot. And so the conclusion of this auction is that it is a combinatorial auction. It preserves the privacy of consumers because they don't have to reveal any private information. They only have to reveal the demand from each provider and the utility that's associated with that demand. It's implemented in real time. So we don't need to schedule any day ahead markets. And it's also implemented in one shot. So it's not an iterative mechanism. It is scalable and it adopts fair pricing. So all consumers have the same rules. However, it is not strategy proof. So here we assume that consumers share their utilities by being matched to the providers truthfully. However, this may not be the case. And we did not look at the optimal pricing of these distributed energy resources. So to compare with other proposed markets in the literature, energy markets, this proposed combinatorial double auction implements multiple resources, multiple DR providers, it optimizes social welfare, it preserves the privacy of consumers, it's done in a real-time auction format, and it maximizes the revenues of the providers, and it also accounted for the energy emissions and the energy losses. So in conclusion, we've designed a combinatorial double auction for multiple DR providers to sell their resources to a local community of consumers. And we've achieved most of the desirable outcomes of the desirable properties. But for future work, um, first of all, we want to compare this market mechanism with a matching mechanism that can be based on the deferred acceptance algorithm. And this work is being done by one of our master students. And then we want to propose an incentive compatible or truthful mechanism for this combinatorial double auction. However, we're not sure if this can be based on Vickrey-Clark-Grove's mechanism. We also want to look at the pricing of these distributed energy resources. That's it from me today. Thank you.